Um, it brings me great honor to introduce to you today my colleague, Thomas Lynch. Tom and I go back to my days when I was the president of the Finger Lakes Funeral Directors Association, and we had the distinct honor of hosting him to give a presentation to the Finger Lakes Funeral Directors. We also had him come to New York State when he had his new book that came out with his friend, the minister, that discussed how the change in funeral service is a correlation to the change in people's values and the way they worship. And today it is my distinct honor to introduce Tom Lynch, and he's going to be speaking to you today about one of his books that I found great delight in reading about 10 years ago, and then in preparation for this event, I said, I better read this book one more time to remember what it was about. And so this weekend, I had the opportunity to read The Undertaking. And there was a PBS special that was done on the same motif that I strongly recommend. You can probably watch on Netflix, and it's well worth it's really well worth the time to watch that excellent presentation. Well, without any further ado, it's my distinct honor to introduce Thomas Lynch. If you folks have something that you want to say, put it in the chat box or raise your hand, and we will be, throughout this entire presentation, I'll be interrupting and asking Tom questions from the gallery. So Tom, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, David. And I'm hoping that you can hear me. And as I said, when David said it was nice to see me, I said it's good to be seen and not viewed in our line of work. So I'm very glad to be among you, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak to you tonight. I'm also gladdened to hear that that the conversation amongst and between us will be shaped and directed maybe by your curiosities rather than my own, because I can blather on a variety of subjects ad nauseum, I think is the Latin for until people puke. But I really appreciate it when we go in the direction of your curiosities. And David told me that he reread this book over the weekend, and he has that advantage. I can remember almost everything about this book in its contemplation and its preparation. I remember the day I got the title for it. I remember all the happenstance that conspired to get these little essays together and get them published in various formats before the British editor of my poetry said that he would do a book of these if I ever wanted to. And I said, well, if I get enough of them done, I'll have you do that. And soon after that, my agent, Dick McDonough, the bed of heaven to him, he died 2 summers ago, called to say that he would like to sell the book to an American publisher, which I was happy to hear. They did that, and I think this is true for a lot of writers. Once the book is done and dusted on the shelf in the library, and people are reading it, and you've earned back your advance, and they're still sending you money, you think, oh, that was good. And but you sort of lose interest in those things, because uh, writing has a kind of contagion to it. You just keep doing it. You can't help yourself. And particularly if I've always said that writers are nothing but readers who go karaoke. The more I read, the more I write. And so this book, which is now 25 years old, was the first book in prose that I wrote. And I was, and I only wrote it because the man who edited my poetry over here figured out fairly early in the process that they wouldn't be making any money on my poems because poetry is a minor art in North America. And so people don't buy poetry much. They're glad to have poets in the same way that they're glad to have clean drinking water and good roads, but they just don't want to have to read any poetry. And they certainly don't want to buy any. So maybe for that reason, Gordon Lynch, who was at the time at the house of Alfred Knopf in New York, called me to say that he would like to know if I ever wrote anything besides poetry. And I said, well, I could, of course, because I never said I couldn't write anything. I always felt like as long as you give me a job, I'll write it, you know. So I remember writing the first essay in this. I was at a friend's house in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I had to give a reading of poems that night, and he had just bought a new Selectric typewriter. And he said I could use it to write whatever I wanted to do that afternoon. So I wrote the first essay in this book, which begins, I thought, pretty straightforwardly, where it says, every year I bury a couple hundred of my townspeople. Now, the reason I chose that, the reason I wrote that sentence is because I'd had some practice at sort of telling people what it is I did. I think most funeral directors, if they belong, at the time I was a past president of the Rotary Club in Milford, Michigan. And whenever the program chairman didn't do their job so that somebody from the drain commissioner's office or somebody behind the library millage didn't show up to give us 15 minutes of talk to go along with our luncheon, then they would choose one of the Rotarians to give what they called a classification speech, which is a speech to, there's only one of every occupational group in most Rotary clubs, one disc jockey, one roller skater, one serial killer. It's just, and there was one funeral director, and I happened to be that person for many years. And so whenever they chose me to do the classification speech, I'd just tell them, every year I bury a couple hundred of you people, and then I take some to the crematory. Now, I have to tell you that it's very, it makes me feel good when I get notice that, you know, the Spaniards or the Italians or the Taiwanese have paid for the rights to print this book in their country for X number of years. And they always do this by sending a check. And it used to go to my agent, and he would cut a check less his fee. But now it just comes to me because the poor man died during the first months of this pandemic. But in many ways, much of what I've done since writing The Undertaking has been shaped by The Undertaking. I was honored to be asked to speak among, you know, to funeral directors and a lot of clergy people who found this book of interest. And up until a few years ago, when I kind of decided that speaking to funeral directors might not be the best use of my time, because it seems like the ones who got it didn't need me to tell them. And the ones who didn't weren't going to get it. Because unlike a lot of different occupational groups, I think funeral directors are, in a sense, their own experts. They each have their own sense of authority in their own town. That's why they don't call them funeral suggesters. They call them funeral directors. And that makes sense, because somebody has to make, you know, decisions in real time about what's going to be done when someone dies. But for me, I was the son of a funeral director and the brother of funeral directors, and now I am the uncle and father of funeral directors, and that's all we do in our particular household, with a couple of notable exceptions. And funeral service has been very, very good to us, but it also allowed me to pursue a career as a writer. And it's kind of curious. I think this coming September, I will be going to Ottawa to speak to the funeral directors and cemetery people at their annual conference. I'll give them a keynote. And I think either the same day or the same week, I'll be speaking to the International Writers Conference they hold every autumn in Ottawa. And it'll be, I think, the first time where I'll actually have an overlap of these two preoccupations of mine, funeral service and writing, all at the same time. And I just feel very fortunate because of it. So I don't have any special knowledge. I assume that everybody who spends, 40 or 50 years undertaking has their own reasons. The only thing I had was I had told my father I would write a book about funeral service, and that was very important to him. And so when he died too young and too soon in 1992 is about the time I began writing these essays, and I only did because Gordon Lish had asked me to write one. And because of that, when I think it was last year, they collected my new and selected essays in this book called The Depositions. And so this has every prose essay I've written in I think a half a dozen different books of essays, and I could select from each one of them. But I dedicated this book to Gordon Lish because of it, because had I not been tasked with writing an essay about what it is I do, he said, then I probably never would have written The Undertaking. I'm glad I did. I'm glad that the people from PBS Frontline wanted to do a documentary about the book, and they gave the film the same name. And they spent a long time kind of following us around. I kept hoping they'd make me look like Brad Pitt. It didn't work, but they have it on that, you can see the film online. They show it every year or two, usually during the Feast of All Saints and All Souls. But in any event, the selection of these essays, the writing of these essays has helped keep me sort of tuned into what it is we do as funeral service people. And so I'm glad I've written it, and it informs an awful lot of the other literary interests that I have, which include poetry, of course. And at the moment, I'm writing a long fiction, a novel about a trade embalmer who's a combat veteran. I believe he's going to be dead before the story starts, which is always easier. And the narration, the point of view, will belong to his assistant and his paramour, but that's assuming I get it done. There's no guarantee that I will. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. You can't hurt my feelings. So if you want to be disagreeable, it's okay with me. I live alone on a lake with a dog, and the dog is having second thoughts about that arrangement because we've been stuck up here in quarantine for quite a while. And while I do a little bit of traveling still, I'm not as eager to leave here as I used to be. So if anybody has any questions, we'll start with that. And if not, I'll read you a poem. And so, David, are you still there? And are you still wondering about? Yeah,
I am still here. And why don't you start off with a poem?
All right. Well, you had said that one of the things you liked in the book was the chapter that had to do with Mary Jackson and building the bridge to go across the Huron River in our town, which supplied the more connected route to Oak Grove Cemetery, where if everything goes according to custom and planning, I'll probably end up buried there if I die within the same zip code. But Mary Jackson, who some of you will remember the Waltons. You have to be fairly old to remember that show, but it was on every week and it starred a bunch of happy-go-lucky, where were they from? North Carolina or someplace? I don't know. But one of the characters were the Baldwin sisters, who had the recipe for their grandfather's whiskey that they would make in a still and use to their advantages, from all I could tell. But Mary Baldwin, who lived in Milford, or Mary Jackson, who lived in Milford, was one of the Baldwin sisters in that show for what, the 20 or 30 years it's on. And she was an actor. She lived most of her life in Hollywood, but she kept a home just a block away from me. And we were good friends because when she heard that I wrote stuff, she came in to commission a poem that she could read at the opening of this bridge that she was going to press the city fathers to rebuild, that connected her neighborhood to her family lot in Oak Grove Cemetery. Well, of course, I assumed that she would never get it done because this was during the recession and real estate booms of the 70s and 80s in Milford. So I thought there'd never be a bridge. I wouldn't have to deliver the poem. So when she said, would I do it? I said, oh, of course, Mary, because you want to be on the good side of well-heeled celebrity, B-list celebrities in your own town. So, but then she actually got the money. She actually got them to put up the money, and the bridge began to take shape. And they set a date for the opening of the bridge with balloons and dove releases and old timers walking across the bridge, and Mary Jackson hooked to a microphone reading out a poem that I was supposed to write. So I was down to the last couple days. I figured I better write it. And here's that poem. It's called At the Opening of Oak Grove Cemetery Bridge, and it contemplates the route we took through town for all the years when the bridge was out, when we had to drive around through town to another bridge further up the river. So I hope that helps. At the opening of Oak Grove Cemetery Bridge. Before this bridge, we took the long way around up First Street to Commerce, then left at Main, taking our black processions down through town among storefronts, declaring dollar days, going out of business, final markdowns. Then pausing for the light at Liberty, we'd make for the south side by the Main Street Bridge, past used car sales and party stores, as if the dead required one last shopping spree to finish their unfinished business. Then eastbound on Oakland by the Jelly Works, the landfill site and unmarked railroad tracks, by bump and grinding motorcade we come to bury our dead by the river at Oak Grove. And it is not so much that shoppers gawked or merchants carried on irreverently, as many bowed their heads or paused or crossed themselves against their own mortalities. It's that bereavement is a cottage industry, a private enterprise that takes in trade long years of loving for long years of grief. The heart cuts bargains in a marketplace that opens after hours when the stores are dark, and Christmases and Sundays when the hard currencies of void and absences nickel and dime us into nights awake with soured appetites and shaken faith and a numb hush fallen on the premises. Such stillness leaves us moving room by room, rummaging through cupboards and the closet space for any remembrance of our dead lovers. numbering our losses by the noise they made at home in basements, tinkering with tools, or in steamy bathrooms where they sang in the shower, in kitchens where they labored over stoves or gossiped over coffee with a next door neighbor, in bedrooms where they made their tender moves. Whenever we miss that division of labor whereby he washed, she dries, she dreams, he snores, he does the storm windows, she does floors, she nods in the rocker, he dozes on the couch, he hammers a thumbnail, she says, ouch. This bridge allows a residential route. So now we take our dead by tidy homes with fresh bed linens hung in the backyards and lanky boys in driveways shooting hoops and gardens to turn and lawns for mowing and young girls sunning in their bright new bodies, first to Atlantic and down Mont Eagle to the marshy north bank of the Huron where blue heron nest, rock bass, and bluegill bed in the shallows, and life goes on. And on the other side, the granite rows of Johnsons, Jacksons, Ruggles, Wilsons, Smiths, the common names we have in common with this place, this river, and these winter oaks, and have likewise in common our own ends that bristle in us when we cross this bridge, the cancer or the cardiac arrest or lapse of caution that will do us in. Among these stones, we find the binding thread. Old wars, old famines, whole families killed by flus. A century and then some of our dead this bridge restores our easy access to. A river is a decent distance kept. A graveyard is an old agreement made between the living and the living who have died that says we keep their names and dates alive. This bridge connects our daily lives to them and makes them once our neighbors, neighbors once again. So I have to say that when Mary Jackson read that poem at the bridge over this little river with a gathering of my townspeople around on I think it was a July day, I was moved as if I hadn't written it, but hearing it, I thought, whoever wrote that did a fine job because Mary really read it well. And I wish she hadn't died. I wish she was still up and reading it, because she gave it the best reading I ever heard of it. And I was glad that she asked me to write it. And yeah. And like so many things, it continues to tell me more about what funeral service or what funerals mean to me, which has been a constant study of my life. I've always felt like I'm very privileged to be around when this kind of terrible moment in a family history unfolds before my eyes, and they ask me to help with it. So I don't know, it just feels like it feels very much like a calling to be good at it, So
what I found really interesting and why I wanted you to lead with that poem was I kind of found it interesting on the backstory behind how it was written and how that the city fathers say we don't have any money to build a bridge. Go through town. It's only the dead. Okay.
Yeah.
And when I read that chapter a couple times because it really meant a lot to me. Coming out of the pandemic and doing work in New York City,
yes,
and seeing how the dead were not being taken care of in the manner that they should have been taken care of, thus the bridge. I think the main driving point in that chapter was that the bridge was a part of getting people to where they belong, at rest. And that's what we do as undertakers. We get them to that point at rest. And when the bridge is out, we try to reroute the process and go around other areas to get to that final resting place, but it's not the direct pathway to make the dead at rest. And with the pandemic, and maybe you can expand upon this with your experience during the pandemic, is has the pandemic in your community chose another route? And if so, what did you do as the undertaker to try to get them back on the bridge?
Well, you're very observant about you can't tamper with the procession, because the procession is the processing of mortality writ large. Okay, the way we process mortality is by processing our dead, and it is only by getting the dead where they need to go that the living get where they need to be. We can't declare ourselves free of grief. We can achieve good grief, and we can achieve a proper recovery from a death in the family. But it's because we allow the process, the procession, all of the stuff that we have to do, we do. It is by the lifting, the bearing, the showing up, the pitching in, the doing our part. And the terrible, terrible thing about the pandemic, apart from the near million dead of something that was needless, and at some point history will have to record that the richest, most medically fit nation in the world had the worst response and the worst things happen, the worst results of that response of all the nations in the world. There is no reason for people as equipped as the United States has been that 1 million people should have died. But just as it overwhelmed the medical infrastructure and clearly overwhelmed
Sorry, could you say that again? Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Just as it overwhelmed all those things, it overwhelmed the mortuary infrastructure, so that we were unable to process. We were unable to gather because it was disallowed, usually by government fiat or good orderly direction. We just couldn't have rooms full of a couple hundred people breathing on one another when a virus for which there was no vaccine was raging in our communities. So I think we have a whole generation that's a couple years old, that of people who suffered primary deaths in their family and serious deaths in their community, whether the community was their church, their civic community, their school, whatever it happened to be, but they couldn't gather. They couldn't get the safety in numbers, the sharing of grief that makes it all more bearable. And I'm one of them. My daughter died in the summer of 2020 by suicide, God help us. And on the one hand, I know that when I said that that by getting the dead where they need to go, the living get where they need to be, I know that by getting her poor little body back from California and into our care and into the grave in the cemetery at Oak Grove, by going over the bridge, which is better than anything else, a metaphor for the other side, by going from one side of the river to the other, by crossing over, we are enacting what is the spiritual and emotional conduct that we have to accomplish. So Mary Jackson was right, and she knew it. And the town fathers eventually relented and just said, build the bridge, because if not, she'll curse you, and you don't want that to happen. So, And I was just glad to be on her side and included in it. But we're going to have to look very carefully in metropolitan areas like the city of New York and in large communities everywhere and see what we weren't able to accomplish for those families. Because I don't believe that just goes away. I think that we, grief has its way with us one way or another. It takes its toll. And if to the extent that we're willing to pay the toll up front, we're better off usually. It's when we try to hoard our feelings and keep them from showing is that they come back to bite us with all the interest they've accrued. So
I had a professor once in college, and he said, you either pay the undertaker or you pay the therapist. Either way, you pay the exact same amount.
he may have heard that from me, and I stole it from my dad, who
Well,
probably
you know what? I know this professor, and he stole many of things from other people and called it his own. So I will give you I will honor you with that. I
I stole it, David. I stole it from my dad, and I think he stole it from Howard Rather, the head of heaven to both of them.
Right.
And the full quote is, you can pay the undertaker or pay the shrink or pay the priest. You're going to pay the bartender. You're going to pay. Grief will have its way with us. And you can try this at home. You can see this. You can see them walking in the door, the people who are still carrying the residuals of something that they should have taken care of years ago.
Right.
So one of the nice connections I was able to make through the undertaking has been a correspondence and friendship with Alan Ball, who some of you know as a filmmaker and TV maker. He did 6 Feet Under, but he wrote the introduction for this book because he reckoned he owed me something. But he talks about the death of his sister when he was 13. They were both passengers in a car. She died instantly. He walked away without a scratch. And he was an adult before it came to him that he'd have to deal with that. And he talks about that directly. So, yeah. Well, God bless your professor. I don't know where you heard it, but I'm guessing
I think he heard it from Thomas Lynch.
Oh, he heard it from, it's all downstream. I mean, T.S. Eliot says all poets borrow, great poets steal, and I intend to be great. I'm stealing every chance I get,
Somebody made the comment in the chat that they struck the statement that you were getting the attention of the media, but it's trying to make it a cultural event. Can you explain how the funeral is kind of like a cultural event for the community, as well as the grieving event, how it is not only a grieving, but it's also a cultural thing that the community participates in?
Well, it is correct to say that the community is responsible for developing the model for whatever the done thing is. So every community doesn't do it the same way. Every culture doesn't do it the same way. Every religious culture doesn't do it the same way. But somebody in the culture is responsible. Either the rabbi, the bishop, the head of the family. Somebody says, when one of our kind dies, here's what we're going to do. Whether we bury or burn or blow them out of a cannon, it doesn't much matter. But the done thing is the done thing. And it's when we stray from that model that we sometimes are off on our own. For example, I have a house in West Clare. I've been going there for more than 50 years. When a death occurs in that little agricultural townland of 1,000 people at its highest number, but it's down to the couple hundred now. When a death occurs, everybody comes into action. The men go out and dig the grave. And the old men, like me, get to stand and watch and collect the bones, because the dead are buried in an old grave. So we pick up the bones of Sonny's mother and father buried years ago and put them in a bag. And then once Sonny goes in, we put the bag back in. And this is the done thing. And while we're digging the grave, somebody else is cooking the food. Somebody else is getting credit with the publican to bring a bunch of beer to the house and whiskey. Somebody else is calling the priest and saying you can only say so many rosaries. Everybody has their job. And the undertaker comes in with the big box and the big car. That's basically his stock and trade. And he's got the schedule. So, yes, it is a cultural model. But if anybody tried to get away with not doing some of it, like if the Moveen lads didn't dig your grave, it would be kind of, I mean, a backhoe can do it, but it's not the same as when your neighbors do it. Just as it's not the same when the funeral director comes and lays out the body. It's better when the women from the same townland come and they prop a prayer book under your chin to keep your mouth closed, pennies on the eyes, and the old fashioned to keep your eyes closed. Now pretty much everybody's embalmed and then brought home to make it look like the neighbors did it. But it's the presence of the dead at their funeral is not in question in places like Ireland or Italy or elsewhere. And it's not just a Catholic thing, it's a human thing. And you can see this now. There's a great fear in the current misadventure in Ukraine. There's a great fear that among those Russian convoys are trucks with crematories in them, because obviously it's a political cost to have bodies coming back, to Volgograd or Moscow or any place else in the country of dead soldiers. It's less disruptive to have a box of ashes. People don't notice as much. And so wouldn't it be politically astute if you want to invade a country, if you make your dead disappear before the soldiers come home? And this is a real concern that at least, one news agent that I was listening to was talking about. Now, we'll see as time goes on, but the culture is responsible for this stuff. So yes. And the culture also doesn't much care if you get your grieving done. They expect, if they provide a venue for you to do it, go ahead and do it, But if you don't, you can pay the shrink or the bartender.
Jennifer Schmidt, if you could just put your microphone on and ask your question, and then after you get done asking your question, if you can turn it off.
Hello.
Hi,
Glad
Jennifer.
you're here. Thank you so much, David, for getting this done for us all and inviting us. Mr. Lynch, thank you for sharing your stories with us. I'd like to ask about your influences, who you liked, who are your favorite poets, and who do you think your influence comes from?
What a nice question. I just have never had a bad experience with reading. Even crummy books give you reason to know what's crummy about them. My favorite poets, I think, I'm, predictably Irish about this. I love William Butler Yeats. I read him as a young man. I've never stopped reading him. Seamus Heaney, Edna St. Vincent Millay's sonnets, I think, are magnificent. She was a polyamorist before it was, sort of fashionable. And she wrote like someone who knew what she was talking about. And her sonnets in particular count syllables better than Shakespeare, who was not bad. I just gave a book of Shakespeare's sonnets to the teenage son of a theologian who's a friend of mine, because he was going to have his first date. And I instructed him to memorize a couple sonnets and just let them go every once in a while, because second only to maybe the news of the world, the wooing of other humans is the only good use of poetry. So I think he'll try it. I think he'll do just fine, and but I love the sound of language, and Emily Dickinson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Evan Boland, still alive, thanks be to God. Is Evan? No, I don't know. Elaine Nikulinen. Yeah, I've just not had a bad experience with poets. And I read poetry almost, I read Robert Frost's poem about an old man's winter night today, and I thought he was right on the money, you know. Yeah, read that poem if you want, or show it to your father, you know.
That's great.
An old man's winter night, yeah.
In your opinion, what is the best day on the job that you've had, and what really makes you happy in your profession? And I think you touch upon this in your book a lot. You talk about how you do find comfort in consoling people and helping them take their dead to their final place of rest.
I don't think I'm unique in this at all, David. I think most of us who are, I don't have many skills. I'm good at swinging the door. I can write a serviceable obit. I can embalm a body if, you know, everybody's off on that weekend. I can do it, you know, and all of them have certain satisfactions. But when some poor fellow pilgrim leaving the funeral home at night takes you by the shoulders and looks you right in the mug and says, I couldn't have done this without you. And all you've been doing is hefting flowers from one room to another and showing people where the loo is and swinging the door as people come and go and telling them to watch their step on the icy parking lot. When all you do is just the next right thing and people think of you as so needed and necessary, I just think, where else can you do that without like a lot of training? But I grew up with, swinging the door for my dad's funeral home, and I just kept watching him, and I noticed that he was really admired. And so I just kept doing things like that. And I always feel, because I don't know anybody who gets paid enough in this line of work, you know, to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, go out in the dark. You know, everybody can sell you a box. Everybody can sell you a plan. Everybody can sell this, that, and the other thing. The stuff is, anybody can do that, but the substance, that's hard. And the line going out to the place where a death has occurred at 3 a.m. is a short one. It's usually someone like us and a funeral or a clergy person or shaman or somebody who tries to sit with people in the face of that mystery and keep silent with them. That's a gutsy thing to do, you know. I really admire the clergy for that, because I've seen them nearly decked for just showing up and saying, there's something more than this, you know. So
you talk in your book about there's this one part in your book that you talk about driving past the house.
Oh yeah.
Where did that custom come from?
Well, that's still there for a lot of sort of pre-industrial societies, and the sense that people of those sort of settled places had, that the spiritual life, as they say in a fellowship I'm a longtime member of, the spiritual life is not a theory, we have to live it. And so when my cousin Nora sat in front of her firebox on the stone floor and beneath a thatched roof of her cottage near the ocean in County Clare, looking into the fire, she was surrounded by what she said, I'm happily haunted. I am just happily haunted by my neighbors and friends. They're gone in a sense, but they're not gone entirely. And I always thought of it as sort of heaven's mezzanine, you know, the place where they wait until they're absolutely forgotten. But one of the things about cultures that regard the dead as maybe dead and gone, but not gone entirely, is that they believe strongly in sort of reestablishing themselves in place. So going by the house and opening the hearse door was specifically to allow the spirit of the dead to go into the house to re-haunt it for the benefit of the people who were going to live there. They could put the corpse in the cemetery or the crematory, but the spirit of the person and the memories of them inhabited the space in, by the hearth or by the table or by wherever does the family gathers. And I think funerals are a way of trying to negotiate that space. I really think the only reason we go to church is so that we can make the body okay to bury or burn. We're not having altar calls usually when our heart is broken. We're mostly trying to get the body fit for burial, because unless somebody with big medicine says it's okay to bury that body, it's not the person. Well, the part that is not the person, we're wondering, where's that go? And for those of us who are not, who are not sort of religiously adept, we are, in terms of our humanity, we do understand that there are good ghosts everywhere, and we still hear them talk to us. Sometimes in our dreams, sometimes we're not dreaming at all. Sometimes we sound like them talking to themselves.
What was the biggest eye opener for you in your career?
Well, first of all, I've never seen anybody sit up in the coffin. I've been waiting for that because they always say, do they sit up in their coffin? I say, not lately. I haven't seen it, but I think I'm impressed by how, if left to our own devices, people know what to do. If you're at a cemetery, I remember once being at a convention. It might have been, a big exhibit convention, and one of the vendors there had what he called a cremation urn lowering device. And I looked at it, and it was mechanical. It had a little whir and a chain pulley and everything, And I said, "What's that for?" He said, "Well, to lower the cremated remains into the grave." I said, "That seems a little bit much." He says, "What do you use?" I said, "The brother-in-law, or or a niece or a nephew, somebody who can, wear blue jeans, kneel down, and some humanity is involved. What more of a lowering device than your eldest daughter or only son? It just makes sense to me that we would be involved in that. Most of the pallbearers don't report. I wish they had a truck to do that. Most of them think it's an honor to carry the dead to the grave. And most people, when they take part in these things, for years I've been suggesting that people come with us to the crematory, just as they come with us to the cemetery. If we're going to cremate half of our dead, we better get right with the fire part, don't you think? And yet funeral directors are always saying, "No, I don't want to do that." And really, I think less than 15%, though we cremate over 60% of our dead now, less than 15% will go with us to the crematory. No one who's ever gone with us, usually at our suggestion, has ever said, "Boy, I wish I didn't do that." Just the opposite. Always they say, "That had more meaning to me than anything else that happened," because they were there when the body went into the retort. Oftentimes they pushed the button, or at least they could see the fire. We're very good at wrapping God's little acre in all the beauty of evergreens and rhododendrons. We go to burn our dead, which we do more than we bury our dead now, and we give them basically an industrial site. We should figure that out. But at the very least, we should, it makes a difference to me if people go and they say, "Oh, yes, I can see why you asked me to do this." When people thank me for doing things that they would have had to do themselves were it not for me, I think we in funeral service have to know that our job is mostly to encourage and embolden rather than to do for or provide, you know? So, and I think my father was, you know, for his generation of funeral directors, I can remember him always saying, if you take care of the service, the sales will take care of themselves. But the basic mentality of funeral service in the 50 years that I've been in it has been the opposite. It's been take care of the sales and see if the service doesn't take care of itself. It doesn't. So.
What would you say to something, what would you say to someone who told you they were starting off in this career? What would you tell them that you wish you were told prior to you starting the career in funeral service?
You know, I just wish I had known how often you're in the deep end of the pool with people. You know, I think sometimes we, you know, when we go to school, we teach people how to, you know, raise an artery and open a vein and set the features, and they know their way around eye caps and mouth closures and stuff like that. But the other part, the really deeply human part, where people stand confronting their own dead, and by the way, their own mortality at the same time, to be adjacent to that kind of human interaction, that's very, to me, it just seems like a really important place to be. It always has seemed that way. And maybe they're just humoring me, but people treat me like I was there when they needed me to be there. So, you know, I'm retired for the most part now. If they want an obituary, they'll call me or something like that. And there are people who I'll make a drive for. There are people in other countries I fly for, but I just feel like our work puts us adjacent to people in a troublesome time in their family history. And if we know when to hold them and when to say something and when to shut up, that's good.
You talk in your book about Dr. Kevorkian. There's a lot of people that don't know who Dr. Kevorkian was. I was wondering if you can expand a little bit about that.
Well, this happened coincident with my publishing this book in the mid to late 90s. Dr. Jack Kevorkian was the most notable exponent of what he called doctor-assisted suicide. And see, I'm just crazy enough that I take the language seriously enough that I thought assisted suicide itself is an oxymoronic trope. If it's like assisted masturbation. We call that a relationship, right? If someone's assisting you, it's not masturbation, it's lovemaking, I think. And it's the same with assisted suicide. Suicide means one of a kind, sui generis, one murder, one homicide, one dead, you know, and one agent of that death. So an assisted suicide is sort of oxymoronic to me. And what I didn't like at the time was the fact that the media and the body politic saw this as a kind of romance. I saw it in terms of I really didn't like the fact that most of his so-called patients were female, most of them younger than what we would think of as terminal. And I thought maybe this is just gender norming, because at the time, and still today, women attempt suicide much more often, but men succeed, odd word, in suicide much more often than women. So maybe Kevorkian was sort of like assisting them to get their numbers up or something. But after many years of, I mean, he eventually went to jail because his last patient, so-called, he injected on TV, and it's like everything else. People know it when they see it, you know? People know love when they see it. And that's how, you know, we've changed the laws about same-sex marriage in this country, is because people know love when they see it. They may not know all the issues and principles and this, that, the other, but they know it when they see it. And if you ever spent a day at the Secretary of State's office when they've opened marriage licenses to same-sex couples, you know love when you see it. I've done that. And it's the same with homicide. When someone injects you with something, even though you want them to, or have given them permission to, that's called homicide. And to call it suicide is a gloss. It's not linguistically correct or any other thing. So yeah, I shouldn't have probably done it in the same book, but I thought, I'm going to publish a book, I may as well have it in there, you know?
Yeah. So Nicole, why don't you put on your microphone, and Barriga, is that how you pronounce it? Nicole Barriga?
I see it here, yeah.
Yeah, let's see if she can put on her microphone and ask her question.
Are you
She
there,
doesn't.
Nicole? Well, let me read her comment. She says that she recently saw a person close to her dead in the hospital, and it felt like it was just seeing an empty shell in a hospital bed. Hospital people were passing their papers back and forth over the body like it was a package. They did not close his eyes. He was just there. Have you experienced that feeling of not recognizing the person, even if it is the same body? I think I know that feeling of, I've had a lot of clergy say, well, that's just a shell. They're speaking religiously, of course, or theologically, that once the soul leaves, the body is just the remains, the sacred remains. But I do think that I don't think the clergy or the funeral director or the doctor gets to say when it's just a shell. I think the family is the one who gets to decide when the corpse ceases to be dad or mom or Leo and becomes just a shell. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have some period of time between the death and the time of the final disposition, because I think it takes us time to catch up to that fact. And I've seen this happen many times when people will come in to the funeral home to see their family member for the first time. And they'll gaze upon the corpse and they'll say, I don't know what it is, there's something wrong, it's just not him. The salient feature is that last phrase, it's just not him. It's just like too much has changed, it's just not him. And of course, funeral directors think, oh, I used the wrong color of rouge or something, right? I should never have clipped that mustache, you know. But I have found that most times it's just a matter of the person catching up to the reality. And so sometimes I'll say, well, have a seat in the lounge. There's coffee in there. I'll just take a moment, make a few little adjustments, and I'll pull the drapes by, and then 5 minutes later, I'll open them up and they'll come in and they'll say, oh, that's much better. I've done nothing. I've done nothing. And I'm not trying to trick them. All I'm trying to do is give them time for their heart to catch up with their head and their eyes and the rest of it. So either I'm the best embalmer that ever was, and I'm not, or I've figured out part of the difficulty of seeing someone you love horizontal and breathless and unspeakably still. That's a new reality. That's what, who is the poet? Wallace Stevens, who talks about not only the idea of the thing, but the thing itself. That's when the idea of death becomes the dead. And we need to, it takes us a while to catch on to that, so. Anything else?
Let's see what else we got here. Yeah. You think with this technological age, I mean, you've seen it. I mean, you've been in the profession for 30 years, 40 years. And do you think that, people are becoming desensitized to the importance of going with families and being with families during calling hours and funerals?
I think just the opposite, actually. I think one of the lessons of COVID will be that the wake, sitting Shiva, all those religious and cultural practices that gather people around the loss, and gather them physically around the loss in a way that requires them to do something, to bear the dead, or to say something about the dead, or bring a casserole. And all of those things, I think, are deeply human, and I think they're coded into our species. I think our species knows how to do that in a way that maybe Cocker Spaniels don't. And so I do think that if you put a dead body in a box, put it over a hole, and lean a shovel in the direction of some of the family, you don't need to give them instructions. They know what to do. They know exactly. This is coded into us. And so our job is to get rid of the barriers between this deeply human thing we do by disposing of our dead with pause and a sense of meaning. If we can make that go easily without having too many retail events, too many transactions, too many decisions, if we can make it just flow, just process, then I think the dead get where they need to go, and the living, sometimes by walking, get where they need to be. It's a hard trip they're making, a hard journey they're making. But if we walk along with them, they'll never, ever forget us. And you can present a bill for any amount of money, they'll pay you happily. I know that to be true because I've been doing it for years. And I'm not wealthy, but I've never missed a meal. And I don't miss car payments, particularly since I put my son in charge. He's got a credit rating that would, so yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Lonnie Evans has a question. If you put your mic on, ask your question, and when you're done, if you can put your mic off. Lonnie? Okay. John, let's see. Hold on. John Frick, can you put your mic on?
Hello, can I be heard?
You
Yes.
can be heard. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering, because I was particularly interested in how you described grieving through death as paying the same amount each time, no matter how you do it, in terms of mental fortitude. While I've had a somewhat different experience in how, I would say, intense the grieving process is, depending on the circumstances of the death and what I take away from it. I was wondering, have you ever wondered about how the nature of the grief, or the grief itself, or the nature of the death changes depending on what the deceased next of kin take away with it?
Well, John, I'm with you on this. If I gave the impression that grief is always the same, heaven forfend. I mean, I've buried friends, I buried both my parents, and I buried a daughter. None of them were the same. None of them were equal in any way. They were all separate journeys, all of them challenging, difficult, unspeakably difficult, all of them assisted by friends who were willing to belly up to that difficult bar with me. But I think of grief, and here again, I'm stealing this. I think I might be older than anybody here, but I remember Edgar Jackson, a Methodist minister, who wrote a book on grief. It was a tiny book, but I read it. And in which he said that basically grief is the other side of the coin of love. So if you love, you grieve. You can't get away from that. If you want to avoid grief, avoid attachments to your fellow humans. Live in a closet. Speak to no one. You know, and this is why a million deaths don't rattle us as much as the one death in our family. Because grief is the other side of the coin of love. It's not the other side of the coin of acquaintance. When a celebrity dies, that's not grief. That's spectacle. Now, we may all feel like connected to other humans going through that. So if it's Princess Di or Betty Boop, you know, I mean, we all feel something when a death in the larger sense happens. But no, I believe that each death has to be, you know, sort of tended to. But I do think it is like love. And so if you love with reckless abandon, you can expect to grieve with reckless abandon. You can't shortchange it. There's almost a math to it, John. That's what my thinking is, you know. If you love this much, you're going to grieve that much.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. Interesting.
And you can't make the decision after the death occurred.
Right.
You know, when you anteed up, whatever it is you're anteing up in a relationship, that's when you decide how much it's going to hurt.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
You bet.
Thanks,
Thank you.
thanks, John. Great question. Miranda, you have a question?
No, I don't have a question. I just wanted to comment that I agree with Mr. Lynch just saying that like during the pandemic, I feel like funerals have actually brought families together. At least in my case, my family, we live all over the place. Like we're very separated or like we don't really get along. And I hate to say it, but when my cousin died during the pandemic, that was really the only time we didn't argue. Like we actually came together and we had
Yeah.
fellowship with one another.
Oh, Miranda, I'm so glad you mentioned that because I've noticed that happens a lot, that people who are real quarrelsome, when a death occurs, somehow they all rise to the occasion and sort of, you know, do the next right thing for one another. It might only last a couple of days, but, you know, it seems to work. So, yeah, you're very observant, Miranda. Carry on.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts about, you know, the healthcare during COVID-19? And what are your feelings about, oops, trying to control my screen here. Healthcare being a third leading cause of death and the fourth decade of SOP. I don't understand what SOP is. Protocol killing thousands in New York City. I think the question that is being asked is, you know, what is your thoughts about, you know, I think you started with this in the beginning. Here we are, a country, a great country that, you know, has the best medicine in the world, and yet we were so unprepared for this situation. You know,
I don't think we were unprepared. I think our body politic sabotaged us. I really do.
Do you think that that's still going on? Do you think
It
that?
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course it is. When you have still 30% of the population that will never get vaccinated. I mean, the math of this is sooner or later they will die, or some other people will get sick and die. But it just elongates I mean, other countries don't work that way. But because we've had this ongoing conversation about whose rights prevail, the community welfare or the individual. This is why we have more guns and more gun deaths. I mean, than other countries who they don't put up with that. And I don't have a dog in the fight as far as, you know, I appreciate everybody's different opinion on that, but when it comes to public health, it just seems pretty straightforward. You know, we do know that most of the people who are hospitalized and dying are people who are not fully vaccinated. Now, That just makes sense to me that we would, and I understand that we can't mandate this and mandate that, but to politicize COVID-19 seems remarkably stupid. And I don't think you can fix stupid. I think stupid is going to be with you, you know. So, and I think that'll prove itself to be true.
Great. Melissa Schmidt, would you like to put on your microphone and pose your question? Okay, she must have some issues, but talking about changes in the funeral industry has been a little chatter among the younger funeral directors.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a significant change going on?
Well, I do think there'll be changes in the way people get the goods. Services are a little bit more difficult. If there was a website that would come to your house at 3 a.m. and pick the corpse up off the kitchen floor, I think we'd all be in trouble. But I don't hear of .com willing to do that. They might have, you know, phone numbers, you know, somebody who I mean, you might access your service by using technologies of different varieties. But I think when somebody calls at 3 a.m, it takes more than technology. It takes humanity to get in the car and drive out there with an intention to help. That's humanity. Now, there's all sorts of technology. I mean, we spend as much time on a funeral video as we used to spend on you know, laying out the dead. And for reasons, because more people will come into the funeral and stand around and watch the video than stand around and look at the body. It's different. It's more of a spectacle. And it does give a life review that otherwise would require imagination on the part of the people standing in front of the body. You stand in front of the box of a 100-year-old woman, it's harder to see the girl that sat on her mother's lap, or learned to knit from her grandmother, or lost her first child in childbirth. You don't see all those things, or booted a husband or kept one who she shouldn't have. You don't see the whole narrative arc of a lifetime unless you have the imagination to do it. But you can have a video that'll show you pictures from birth, the prom, the wedding, the first divorce, the third marriage. You can get it all, you know, and what they made for the you know, for the potluck at the AA meeting that they go to every Tuesday night. There's a picture for all of that, and so people will watch that because it does provide a kind of biography review that obituaries endeavor to take care of, and time standing with the corpse allows you to. When I go to a wake in West Clare in Ireland, I'm brought into the room where the dead are in their bed, and usually the next of kin is in a chair next to them. And you pay your respects to one and then to the other. And you begin to remember all the interactions you had with that person. I do, because I'm here again and gone tomorrow yank. But somehow the imagination works better in cultures that are not so fraught with, with some of the modernity that we have. So, yeah.
Excellent. And I think Nicole's microphone is working now. Nicole?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Nicole.
Yes, so I remember you were talking about the pandemic, and it's funny, you know why? Because I live in Texas, one of the worst states for the pandemic. And the reason I see that you say that it's political, that's true. But I also can see that here I'm around, like when I'm going to a Walmart, I think I'm the only one wearing a mask. and I'm the only one probably that is seen as a weird person around. And I feel like it's not just political, it's the humanity. Like people is less human now in days, like they are very selfish and they just think about themselves. They don't care about the other ones. And it's something that is it's not just like for who you are going to vote. Um, it's something that is like technology too. Like I feel like it's kind of a little bit destroying like how human we are. And it's a whole thing that I believe that is connected, like with humanity, technology, and selfishness. Is everything connected? I don't know how is your point of view and how I feel about it.
Well, Nicole, what I feel about it is you obviously have thought about this. And I would just be really interested in seeing what you would do if you began to write. If somebody said, I'd like you to write 3,000 words on that topic, on how we've lost touch with our humanity in a variety of ways. I would like to see that, because by writing, if you're going to write it, you have to vet it for what rings true to you. That's the compulsive thing about writing. When you write a sentence that rings true to you, it's a joyous occasion. At least it is for me. And usually I think it's joyous for people who read such sentences. My assistant brought me a copy of this book of mine that she got at a rummage sale. This hurts my ego, of course, but I got over it. But she noticed that whoever sold the book to or gave the book to the rummage sale had annotated all throughout the book with a red pencil, underlining certain sentences. And I'm thinking to myself, as she's reading these sentences to me, I'll stick with that. It was 25 years ago that I wrote it, but it still rings true to me. I'll bet you could do the same thing, Nicole. All you have to do is do it. And I would suggest, what's the worst that can happen? The sky is not going to fall. And if you publish it, then you can be an internationally unknown writer like me. What harm, So it beats being a nationally unknown writer, so.
Yes, I wish I one day maybe I just try to. I'm better communicating with my words when I write
I
than
know.
when I speak.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
know.
and that's especially because English is not my first language.
What's your first language?
It's Spanish.
It's Spanish, yeah. Okay, so I have Ecuadorian nieces and nephews,
I'm Ecuadorian.
Are you really? Well, that's wonderful. Now, let me tell you the one thing I can say. Parlo magnifico day parlos los irlandeses. I think that means it's a great day for the Irish, but it's a great day for the Ecuadorians as well. And so whether you write in Spanish and have someone translate, or you write in your English, you will have a readership, I promise you. I promise you. And it just gets you out of your own self. So
Yes.
as
Thank
I
you
always
so
say,
much.
go and sin some more,
Thank you. I appreciate your words. They are very nice.
Well, you're very kind to listen. So thank you.
Tom, when I write, I sometimes one of my students is probably in the classroom right now. But one time we were coming back from the diner and I got an inspiration to write. So I pulled over the car and I said, whatever you do, don't say a word. And for like 15 minutes, I wrote, and I got into this trance.
Yeah.
And when I got out of the trance, it was like the greatest experience that I ever had. It was like Christmas Eve 10 times over. And yeah, the student said it wasn't 15 minutes, it was 30 minutes. But talk about, just in closing, talk about that eternal high that you get when you write, and how you can, when you write, there's this amount of energy that is generated just by putting thoughts together and putting it on paper.
Well, you're very kind to ask. I'm going to end with a poem because part of writing poetry is you always have to start with a form. So you can't just blather on, which I'm inclined to do, is to blather on entirely, you know? And, but if you know that you're going to write a sonnet is 14 lines. So, you know, when you're at 12 lines, you got to start wrapping up now, you know? And so it's very helpful that way. And it's joyous if you can nail it, you know? I carry these little 3x5 notebooks with me, and I fill them up day in and day out. I've got, you know, shelves of them, and I go back through them sometimes to see if I was making any sense to myself. But one day I decided, I was 52 years old. You probably heard this story. I turned 52 and I thought, I haven't written a poem all year. I better write a poem. This was 20 some years ago now. And so I said, I'm going to write a sonnet for my birthday. And I wrote the sonnet, and it turned out to have 15 lines, not 14. So I called this non-sonnet, Refusing at 52 to Write Sonnets, which is a catchy title for someone who can't count. And I know that it's in this book here. I'll see if I can find it. I probably can just remember it. It came to him that he could nearly count how many Octobers he had left to him in increments of 10 or say 11. Thus 63, 74, 85. He couldn't see himself at 96. Humanity's advances notwithstanding in healthcare, self-help, or new age regimens, what with his habits and family histories? The end, he thought, is nearer than you think. The future thus confined to its contingencies. The present moment opens like a gift. The balding month, the gray week, the blue morning, the hours, routine, the minutes, passing glance, all seem like godsends now. And what to make of this? At the end, the word that comes to us is thanks. Thanks. It's just that's the feeling I get, that I'm just grateful when I get it done. It feels so good, and gratitude is easier to carry around than begrudgery.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think so, particularly for old white guys like me, and not much you. But if you look at poor Vladimir Putin, he just turned 70. He's an old white guy full of grievance. He's not the first guy to start a war by choice. We have our own guy that did that not so long ago. And so old white guys are a dangerous thing unless they can be more grateful than begrudging. So one of the things that makes me more grateful than begrudging is that the language keeps returning mystery to me. And when I hear like your students say things, I think, wow, it's working for them too. And that's usually because someone's teaching them or someone's saying, yes, you can. Didn't we have a president that said, yes, we can? Yeah, God be with the days, because that's the feeling. You can do this. So
thank you. Tom, thank you very much. Every time I listen to you, I just take more and more from your wisdom, your eloquence. And
you're going to get over that, David, I promise. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank all the benefactors who made it possible for Tom to be here today. We could not have done it without the generous donations from all the benefactors. Those funeral directors who are in the audience, we will be sending out your certificate by the end of the week. We did take notice of who was in the room, and we will be sending out, if by the end of next week you don't receive your certificate, give us a call and we will take care of making sure that you get your certificate. One of the things, reason why the Funeral Service Administration Program co-sponsored this Living Writers series was because we're trying to fund the Arthur Grabowski Scholarship Fund for our students here at our program. So we will be sending out with your certificate a donation envelope if you feel generous and you want to keep funeral directing alive. You can send us a donation and we will put that in the Arthur Grabowski Scholarship Fund. We thank you immensely for any contribution to this fund. And with that, I like to say to all of you, thank you very much for coming. And until we meet again, may God always be with you.